we are live on the Gamification Revolution. Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Gabe Zickerman. I'm coming to you from a surprisingly sunny New York City. It didn't start out that way, but it's looking good today. And getting close to the Labor Day weekend, so we're happy to have you with us. If you're joining us live for the first time, be sure to log in so that you can actually chat with us and even come on screen. You can ask your questions of our guest today or me. Be sure to click the buttons nearby you to access that, and then once you've actually logged in, you can go further and make sure that you are registered and ask those questions. Click on submit a question, click on the camera button. Anything and everything is possible. Now, also, if you're joining us via the podcast or not joining us live today, I'm sorry you won't be able to ask questions, but you can follow along in the future with me. I'm at gzickerm on Twitter, and we'll tell you all about our great guest today, who is Karl Kapp, joining us from Pennsylvania. Hi, Karl.
Hey, Gabe, how you doing? Great to be here.
So excited,
Thanks for
so
having me.
excited to have you. Okay, so Karl, many people probably know you, recognize you as the guy who's basically written the book on gamifying instructional design and education. And we're going to talk about your book and we're going to talk about this topic, but I want to start off by asking you a question that I think so many of us want to know. Why has it been so incredibly difficult to get teachers and instructional designers to embrace the principles of games and make courses more interesting?
Yeah, boy, that's a great question. I think, well, I can start with instructional design. One of the things, the big difference I think between an instructional designer and a game designer is that instructional designers start with content and they want to teach content. But a game designer starts with an activity or an action. And so I think it's a really different mindset to move from a content orientation to an action orientation. And I think teachers and are afraid now to implement games because of the No Child Left Untested laws that were passed and finally expired. But how does a test map back to what you're doing in a game? And if is what you're learning in the game matching to the test? And how do I know they're going to do well on the test? And there's a lot of worry about that. So I think the paradigms just have not been there for game-based learning, and that's why both instructional designers and teachers kind of shy away from it a little bit.
Well, so you wrote this,
But
yeah,
it's
you wrote this book, The Gamification of Training and Instruction, right, which is meant to be a kind of
right.
sort of Bible for how to do this thing. So why now then? What, if it's been so challenging, what suddenly brought us to the point where it made sense to write that book? What prompted you to do it?
Right. So I had been talking about the idea of using elements of games for a while, but really didn't have the term gamification around. And what I think has happened is when people find out, hey, I don't have to spend $100,000 to build this huge game for my classroom or for my sales reps, I can actually use elements from games like story or feedback or badges or levels and those types of things without having to go full bore. So I think that's really kind of emboldened people to say, hey, wait a minute, I can use that. I think also, games are mainstream now. In the 1980s, they really kind of weren't mainstream, and they've been catching on all of a sudden. So now when I see people, a lot of the people I work with say, my kids are so engaged with games that I've got to do something in learning with games. Like if I could get my trainees half as engaged, I would be so excited. And I think the technology tools are getting closer too. So all those
All that brought us
combinations.
to this point. It's interesting because Dutch
Right.
in the chat over here has raised a comment that I think we hear from a lot of folks when they talk about making education better, gamification of education. He says creating the control of the classroom is at the heart of many of teachers' issues with with all kinds of new technology. Let's just call it. Let's just talk about gamification for a second. Do you agree with that assertion? Do you think the reason why it's hard to get teachers to embrace games and gamification is control related, or does that feel sort of like a red herring to you?
Yeah, I don't really think. I mean, I've seen lots of classrooms that seem to be out of control, but lots of really great learning was happening, in groups and things like that. So I don't think it's the control. Well, it's the control, I think, of people outside of the classroom dictating what should go inside the classroom. I think that has a lot to do with it. One time I did a thing on games, and somebody called in and said, you know, all these kids are vidiots, and I can't believe that we're not. And so people don't understand the power of learning from games. They understand, um, somebody watches Grand Theft Auto and goes out and does something stupid like shooting somebody, but really has not a whole lot to do with Grand Theft, with the fact that it's a game. It's the content of the game. And I think people don't see that. They think video games and immediately think first-person shooter and don't realize the huge cornucopia of different types of games and the power that has for learning. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what games can do from a learning perspective. And teachers, if the other thing is, they have no paradigm, right? Teachers grew up going to college where they sit in a row and the teacher lectures to them, and then they go out and they lecture to their students, and they didn't play any games for learning, so they don't really have a touch point of how to do that.
So, well, that brings me to,
So I think that's the
yeah, well, that
issue.
brings me to an interesting, I've said this multiple times, that, teachers have a reason to be skeptical. So, every few years, someone comes along and says, this is the next great thing. This is the thing that will solve all the problems of education. They've been doing that. I'm not even that old. I'm about to be 40, but I've seen that happen 3 or 4 times in my career, in my memory, about the next great thing that will happen. So here we are now saying
Right.
games are the next great thing. They're going to solve all these problems. They're the panacea. Don't they have a reason to be skeptical?
Yeah, I mean, I think they should, and I think they should also be careful about which games. So not every game is going to teach. But the interesting thing to me is the research clearly shows that in order for a game to be effective in a learning perspective, you have to do, I call it the old Johnny Carson. You're 40, so you probably almost remember
Of
Johnny.
course I
I don't remember him at all,
do.
but
Right.
right, right. So, but the guest would come on and the guest would set up the clip, they'd show the clip, and then there'd be a debriefing. And that's how games have to be used in the classroom. You have to set up what the learning's going to be, you have to actually play the game, then you have to debrief. Otherwise, it's just an experience, it's not learning. And the research is pretty clear about that. And what happens is I think sometimes games are implemented improperly without that kind of setup and debrief, and then teachers see research about that and say, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. And also, I don't want to get off on this conversation, but the teachers are asked to do so much more now in the classroom than actually teach. And so to try to get a game in there becomes yet one more thing they have to do besides all this other kind of stuff. So I think that's kind of difficulty, but everyone with games should be skeptical until they see some results, but not be so skeptical that they don't accept the evidence. And I find that also, people say, let me see the evidence on game-based learning, and I'll show them evidence, and they'll say, well, let me see case studies of it actually working. So the burden of evidence sometimes becomes their red herring in terms of adoption or acceptance.
So, in fact, then, wouldn't you say kind of, it sounds like what you're trying to say is really that what the gamification of the classroom is intended to do, or games specifically in the classroom, let's talk about that and separate the two for a second. They're meant to
Okay.
replace
Yep.
they're meant to replace, so the games in the classroom are maybe meant to replace the books and the other kinds of medium, and then the standard teacher scaffolding is supposed to continue around that. Is that kind of what you're asserting? Or is there some more grand scheme there for the use of games in the classroom?
Well, I think there's several use of games for the classroom. In multiple paradigms. So in one paradigm, the teacher scaffolding remains the same to bring home the learning and to be the bridge for the learning. But also, I've seen games used very effectively as a method of reinforcement or helping the kids who aren't doing so well. So there's a game called Times Attack that teaches basic multiplication, division, subtraction. It's a wonderful game. And the research that they've done on that of over 35,000 students go from, half of them getting like 30% mastery to 90% of them having 100% to 90% mastery. So there's games for rehearsal or reinforcement. The ultimate thing, though, if we want to get up to Maslow's hierarchy, we want to get to kind of the evaluator synthesis level, and a lot of some organizations are doing this, having kids create their own games,
Right.
because then you have to know the content, you have to think about the dynamics, you have to think about the elements. So I think there's lots of places for games, and textbooks, are very boring and not very exciting, except for current companies, books excluded. But that means really that um, the games are the engagement factor, and the engagement is what helps with learning. And we've got to get away from, we're in such an industrial educational factory setting that it's not sustainable, I don't
Well,
think.
we spend a lot of time, my initial question was sort of focused on the intransigent teacher or learning instructor or instructional designer, the person who doesn't like games. But actually, there's a lot of people who really do like games and gamification and want to bring them into the classroom.
Right.
And Andrew Hughes in the chat today, thanks for this, Andrew, talking about how, he sounds like he's really motivated to bring games and gamification to his environment, but he spends a great deal of his time justifying the use of game mechanics in learning. What are the ways that somebody who is motivated to bring gamification to their learning environment, what kinds of tools do you recommend, Carl, they use? What do they need to bring with them to change the minds of their management and their superiors to make it happen?
Right, exactly. So, hi, hey Andrew, how you doing? Um, One thing, and one of the reasons why I wrote the book, was I was so frustrated and so tired of hearing people say there's no evidence that games teach. Like, there's even people saying, writing articles called "Games Don't Teach," and to me that was really infuriating, because games actually do teach, and there's a lot of evidence that show that they teach. So you could present that evidence as one way. But if somebody doesn't want a game in a classroom, or even in their organization, they'll say, well, that research was only done on, these kind of people in this setting, and so that doesn't work. So I think a stealth way is good to get into games in organizations. So I often recommend adding game elements and calling them, interactive learning experiences, or accelerated simulations, or kind of using terminology that Orwellian speak, I guess, that kind of circumvents the whole concept of game, because it's really the interactivity that makes the game effective from a learning perspective. So what we really need to do is add interactivity to our instruction. And it's what I always say, it's what um, instructional designers have known all along, that learning has to be engaging. It has to start with a challenge. Like, so for example, in instructional design, we do like the worst thing ever. We tell the learners the end of the story before they start. We give them their learning objectives. You will learn 3 ways to do this. Well, so what? I mean, there's no excitement to that. What you need is mystery. So what do you think would happen in this situation? And then that would engage the learner. So we need kind of that mindset. So I think stealthily getting them in there is a good way to do it. Showing the evidence if the person will listen to that, and then showing similar organizations. There's now a lot of organizations that have examples of game-based learning and gamification that have been very
Yeah.
successful. And I think as those organizations catch on, other people are going to be, hey, I can't be left
Well,
behind.
it's interesting. We actually had earlier, in fact, we had a post from Eugene Sheely yesterday on
Mhm.
gamification.co about what most people don't understand about gamified education. It's already quite popular, lots of discussion about it. And I think it dovetails well with this. And one of the things that Eugene was talking about in the post is about how games promote constant education. So they're like a consistent, process of education. Can you talk about how important that is versus the classic kind of sprint sprint test
Right,
waterfall model of the
right.
traditional classroom?
Right. So one of the things that games do really well is they implement 2 really interesting educational concepts. One is distributed practice, and distributed practice is one of the most researched elements in learning, and one of the most effective. So basically, it means that in order for you to really truly learn something, you have to learn a little bit about it over time and not cram. So I always give the example, Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader, that show. It basically shows not if you're smarter than a fifth grader, but how much useless information you get in fifth grade. But what it really does is gives information about um,
I think we may.
has to do with episode.
Yeah, sorry.
Did you lose me for a
Yeah, a
little
little bit,
bit?
but I'm sure it'll show up.
Yeah.
Keep
Okay.
going. Sorry.
Okay, all right. And so distributed practice is really important. So a game, you play a game for a while, and then you can come back and play it again because of the replayability of games. And so you're reinforcing knowledge that you had, you're learning new lessons, you're applying new strategies. So all that happens through that distributed learning process rather than cramming for a test like we all did in college, but we can't remember anything. And actually, research shows that games are really good at teaching people to understand models of systems. And if you do a comparison of education, like you teach uh, using text in a traditional way and you teach the game way, the first time that's done, they're going to be tied pretty much in terms of the learning. But the more often you do, even both of those, the more the game gains an advantage. So in this society where we're all short term and we all want the quickest, way to wisdom, really playing games over and over again are the best way to build models, to build understanding. The second thing is episodic memory, which is emotion. And what we've done a lot in corporate training is taken the emotion out of corporate training. We make it as dull and boring as we possibly can. Maybe the emotion is frustration or boredom. But we know from research, again, that strong emotions tie to learning and allow us to recall. So in your continual game, when he's talking about continual games, they give both the emotion of winning or even the emotion of not winning or figuring something out, that sense of mastery, and also that distributed practice. So it's a really great long-term learning process that can occur using games in educational settings
I
and corporate settings
Yeah,
too.
so it's very interesting, and I know we often the conversation is sort of focused on the kid side of the house, or it sounds like it is, but it sounds like there's actually some overlap there, and I just want to point people's attention to a new feature that we rolled out on gamification.co just a little while ago, which we call our Engage DB, which is a resource that we're attempting to kind of put our arms around all the examples of gamification across a wide range of topic areas and industries and so on. It's at gamification.co, and you can follow the link there for the wiki or the engagement DB, and Ivan's put up a link for you down there. Lots of the examples are about education. What's the difference here, Karl? I think which is important. What's the difference in using gamification in the classroom between adults and children, if any?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Children are much more open to it, much more engaged in it, and much more willing to try it. Um, Adults are socialized that at a certain point you no longer play games, right? You now are serious about your learning, serious about education. But if you look at kids, how they socialize, it's all through games. So kids go to school and they come home and they play school. Somebody plays the teacher, somebody plays the student, somebody doesn't raise their hand, they get yelled at or whatever. Um, and that is a great way to learn and to internalize activities. Adults tend not to do that. So in an adult game situation, I find a lot of times reluctance to get started. Kids will jump right in. The kids, you kind of have to slow them back down a little bit to tell them. Adults are a little reluctant to get in. Once they get going, though, they get very engaged and enthusiastic, but they feel like they're wasting their time because they're playing this game and they're not really
So,
learning.
so that reluctance is
So I kind of have to
so that
explain.
so that reluctance is all about wasting time. Isn't some of it, it seems to me in the work that I've done, some of that reluctance is also fear of maybe being embarrassed or being the first person to like get all into the game. Can you talk more about that initial kind of design issue? How do we get over that
Or losing.
adult resistance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the other adult thing, which is really kind of interesting, is I've had a situation where an adult was playing a game and they got in a losing situation and then just shut down. They felt no longer, this is stupid, this isn't learning, etc. So the onboarding process is really, really key to getting adult learners into the game. So we'll typically have a tutorial round of whatever the game happens to be, whether it's electronic or even a board game, where you cannot fail. You are absolutely going to be successful, and that gives the adult learners more confidence on how they can go in that. It can't be text up front because they'll blow through that. We've done play testing where people go, "Oh, this game doesn't make any sense." We're like, "Well, did you read the beginning stuff?" No. Okay, well then throw that out. So you need to kind of walk them through the tutorial to onboard them. The first round they have to feel that they can't lose, be very successful, and then the second round get a little bit more difficult. What we try to do is kind of pull them in so they don't look embarrassed or don't get upset. The other thing is not everybody's going to love a game. I think one of the myths is that, oh, as soon as we, like you said about the panacea of education, as soon as we introduce a game, everybody will be so enthusiastic to
Right.
learn that they'll never stop learning. And that's not true. There's going to be people there that don't like it. And what I find interesting is there's lots of people that don't like lectures, but they're not vocal about it. They're not visceral about it. But when people don't like games for learning, they're very vocal, and it's a very emotional reaction. And I think fear is part of it, and I think also, um, they see in their background their parents saying, do your homework, don't play games, and I think that kind of carries over.
This was so interesting, and there's been some chatter over here. Folks, so fresh biz folks talking about how kids outperform adults in the workshops that they give, and Sasha talking about
Yeah.
how in the future with people playing more games, this is going to be different. So one interesting thing that I wanted to talk to you about. So I wrote this book, Gamification Revolution, a few months ago, and we actually built this social reading application called Read Social. Goes along with the book. It's at gamrev.com. It's a look at how different companies are using gamification to change their business and industry. And one of the things that we were really focused on was the idea of getting people to finish the book. Just getting them to finish the book is a pretty big challenge because people will buy it, they'll be excited, then they'll maybe forget about it, or they'll read a chapter and put it down. And I want to say that it's a great page turner, but it's no 50 Shades of Grey. It's a book on gamification. So we focused a lot on process, progress, completion. We built this gamified system around the book. Process, progress, completion. Can you talk about how much effort or energy an instructional designer needs to put into thinking about progress, just getting people through the material? How important is that?
It's critically important because what happens in so many we being the learning industry have created so many page turning online, which is basically PowerPoint on steroids, and learners gamify that by seeing how quickly they can click through the course to get to the last quiz. So they make progress, but they're not learning anything. So from an instructional design standpoint, it's really important for the designer to think about, we use the curve of interest that Jesse Shell talks about, but really thinking about how do we move the learner through the content and really engage them at every screen of the content. And that's really tough to do. Like MOOCs, for example, have a 90% dropout rate. Well, why do people drop out of MOOCs? Because they're not engaged in what's happening online. We've taken the traditional boring lecture and we've now
Not
just
fun.
made it available to everybody. Right, exactly. We've made it more boring and more efficient. Um, so we really need to think about the progress, and part of that is the adaptive learning, and that's what games do really well. They adapt to us as we play them, and that encourages us to make progress. So yeah, I think that model is really good. Although, Gabe, being an author myself, it's kind of nice. Once you have a really good first chapter, you're pretty much done.
Yeah, right, exactly. Now,
Right? Yeah, right. Nobody reads the rest. You don't have to worry
who
about it.
cares? The intro is great.
All right.
We have a question
Right.
from
Yeah.
we've got a question from Ivan Lombardi. Hi, Ivan. If it's your first time watching us, welcome. So he's asking about language education, and I want to, and whether we've got good examples of using gamified classrooms to teach language education. And I also want to just frame this question a little bit more broadly, which is are there different gamification strategies that an instructional designer or teacher has to use for different kinds of topics? So if you have an answer for Ivan, that would be great. If not, I'm sure we can point into some other research. And then how do we
Yeah.
divide this by area of interest and topic?
Right. Well, there used to be an awesome 3D game. So my first experience in a 3D environment, um, Second Life, it was German as a second language. And first of all, I only speak one language because I'm American. And the way they taught that class was horrible. They walked you into a virtual classroom, sat us down in front of a virtual PowerPoint, and showed us sentences in English that we repeated in German. And I thought, what a waste. Why not put us in, a bar and have us order a beer in English, or have us try to catch an airplane or a bus or whatever? So there was a course called 3D language that actually immersed you into a town, and you had to speak the language. So there's several kind of games out there that let you kind of do that. But in terms of different content requires different types of games. So for example, if you're just teaching somebody terms or jargon, a Jeopardy type game can work, a Wheel of Fortune type game can work, matching game can work. But if you want to teach somebody strategy, then you need a game that's a little bit more robust, something like a multi-layered board game that has resources that you allocate or that you obtain, or something like um, business simulations. The problem I see is a lot of people try to take a game like Jeopardy and try to put conceptual information into it, or problem-solving information, and say, "Oh, look, this game is gonna." It's not. Different types of games are geared toward different types of learning. So it's very important to match what you're trying to teach with the genre of the game that you're putting together. So that becomes really kind of important as you think about how to create effective learning through a game. You can't just have a toolkit of a couple Jeopardies and a couple multiple choice, get some point things for all of your learning. Those are great for certain types of learning, but not for all types of learning.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I think that's why, books like yours, the field book on gamification learning, and the actual book on gamification learning that you've written, the link to is there on the screen for everyone watching. Why this is so important, because obviously they're different for different kinds of things. I actually saw a French startup doing, education of basic math skills, and they had made a gamified environment out of it. And one of the things was they were, trying to teach people angles. And I remember, learning basic sort of geometry in school. And so because this was possible on the tablet, they actually had, like a compass, like we used to use, and a protractor, like we used to use in class, except
Oh
that
yeah.
they were manipulatable on the tablet. So you were basically just given, what you were given was just an angle and a protractor, and you had to figure out that you were actually trying to figure out the angle of that angle, and that's what you needed to discover. And
Hmm.
it was abstract, and actually for me for a second, I was stumped by what I was supposed to do on this particular level. And then I remembered, I was like, oh, I'm, not a 6-year-old gamer kid who would immediately recognize that they were supposed to engage in some kind of challenge. So we've got one, and there's been a really spirited discussion about other language learning applications. For those of you who watch the replay, you'll be able to see talking about Duolingo and folks talking about what they like and memorize and so on. I have one last question for us before we run out of time today, and this is from Sasha, who's a regular watcher of the show and speaker at G Summit. So Sasha's talking about the motivation of teachers, and I just want to shift our discussion, and a good question, Sasha, but I want to shift this discussion just for this last minute from you, Karl, and I want to understand, how do we gamify the teacher side of the equation, the instructional designer side of the equation? So we spent all of our time talking about the students. What about the instructors?
Right.
What do we need to do to get them more engaged in the process of creating great content and delivering training?
Right. One of the things that I think we need to do, in education and teacher education, is teach them how to create games. Um, it's really not a native skill that somebody can just go, oh, okay, I'm going to create a game. I just did a game workshop yesterday in Indianapolis, and we were teaching these people how to create games, and it's very interesting, and people don't know how to get started. And I think teachers would be able to share their enthusiasm, implement that game elements into the classroom if they understood game design and game development. So I think in colleges throughout the country and teacher prep schools, we should teach them how to create games, how to play games instructionally, where they fit into the curriculum. So the problem is that there has not been enough education for the teachers in the right area. We're still factory teaching teachers, and we're not really preparing them for the information age
That's
that we're in.
that's a fantastic observation, and thank you so much, Carl, for being with us today. I really appreciate it. You can follow Carl at Kapp on Twitter. And for those of you who are regular visitors and joiners of the show, you'll know that there's always something exciting. It's such an interesting session, but it goes by so fast. Thanks for being with us today, Carl.
Yes. Thanks for having me, Gabe. This has been fantastic,
I
and
thank you.
hope to do it again sometime.
Thank you. I hope that you do come back.
Thanks.
And for those of you who will be with us next week, join us at the same time in the same place and hear me talk to John Radoff, well-known game designer and innovator of the 12 things that people like. If you've taken a course with me, you know I talk about that all the time. In the meantime, I encourage you to visit gamification.co and find out more about how you can apply gamification to your products, processes, and services. I'm Gabe Zickerman. Follow me on Twitter at @gzickerm. See you next week. And in the meantime, everyone, keep having fun. Take care.
Yeah, thanks.